Hey guys, I'm going to help you out a little bit and walk you through the first 10 of the biology benchmark, and I will put I'll add 3 different videos so that you get all 27 of them, at least somehow give you a way to deduct the actual answer with each of these. So let's just go ahead and jump right in and start with number 1, and we go back to the very beginning of our semester. It says ions move across selectively permeable membranes through protein from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. So if we go back and we just look and we find that it is indeed active transport because you're having to move from a lower to a higher concentration. And that's similar to when we talked about pushing the boulder up the hill, that it would take energy. And indeed, active transport does take energy. Number 2, ions moving across selectively permeable membranes through a membrane of high concentration to low concentration. Go ahead and mark this for you. Are moved in a process called what? Now, at first, I read this question and I actually skipped one of the main key points here is the word protein. And if you skip that, you will get this question wrong and you will stick with diffusion, when indeed that's actually very wrong. And the protein part of diffusion is what aids in bigger things to go through the membrane. So therefore, in this case, it's going to be facilitated diffusion is going to be the answer. Now, had they have left out that word protein, then in that case, it would have been simply diffusion. Number 3, if you contrasted positive and passive and active transport, what would be the main difference? And the main difference, if we look with active and passive transport, the main thing is that with passive transport, remember, because if it's passive, you don't have to do anything, you don't have to add anything, it's not necessary. Then you have one key thing missing from passive transport, and that is the use of ATP. So in that case, and our ATP is our energy, so we have, if you contrasted passive and active transport, the main difference would be the fact that you don't need energy. Number 4 is plant cells in a hypertonic solution, and this is kind of a difficult to grasp, that if you put a plant cell in a hypotonic solution, what's going to happen? And in this case, we're going to lose water and wilt because of the way the hypertonic solution will actually cause. And the reason why is here is because you're hypertonic. It gives that solution it gives this solution the ability to actually shrink. So here's your hypertonic, here's an isotonic, and then here's a hypotonic. So be careful when you're reading those, and you're careful to see and read those words, the hyper. Make sure you don't mess those up. So this would be B. Okay. Next, unicellular organisms are placed in an isotonic solution for 30 minutes. So we put it in a solution that's equal on both sides. After the 30 minutes, small amounts of salt solution are added. So we're adding some salt solution. What's the result of the movement of water after 1 hour? So the answer is going to be B, that eventually, after we keep adding salt to the outside, that our organism's going to shrink. And that's just because you keep adding salt to the outside solution. Okay. Number 6, which cellular process requires the presence of oxygen to produce energy for the organisms that carry out cellular respiration? In order to do cellular respiration, and if you need oxygen, the only thing you can have is either aerobic or anaerobic. And in that case, we look and we see that anaerobic, AN, requires no energy, and then aerobic does require energy. So we go back and we see that this is simply a definition question. It's which one needs energy, which one doesn't. Number 7, if osmosis was occurring in the following picture, What is the most likely scenario for what could happen? So in this case, our water level is going to shift to the left of the beaker because we have more in that side. So the water level is going to increase on the left side of the beaker, and that's going to give us that answer, and it will not let me highlight that. So that is the answer. Number 8, a great example of osmosis is what? In this case, the only thing when we're dealing with osmosis is the net movement of water, and it is passive, so it requires no energy whatsoever. Now, here's the thing. We can do process of elimination and get rid of the first one. That sodium and potassium pump has nothing to do with osmosis. We look at CO2, and CO2 moves freely across in a passive transport. But the one key thing that's missing in osmosis for our definition is the fact that it needs to move water. So C is lettuce wilting in salt water. So it does say salt, but we're still moving in water. So that would be the best answer just by process of elimination because it talks about needing water. And that will be that. And then energy, D, being required to pump is not okay because osmosis is passive and it requires no energy whatsoever. The following shows the removal of a phosphate group from ATP. What is the end result? So if I'm looking at ATP synthesis and I'm looking at all these phosphates, as soon as I break a phosphate, in the end, the main thing I get is energy. Okay, and we talked about that and talked about that and talked about that. So the answer is going to be that because as soon as I break that phosphate, I'm going to release energy. And in that energy is where I get those ATPs, and that's how I get ADP, and this is how I get my energy in talking about cellular respiration. Okay, number 10, where's the glucose made in plants and photosynthesis? Now, I had a lot of questions about this Friday, and a lot of you wanted to say that it was made in the stroma. Well, it's not made in the stroma. It's actually made, no, I'm sorry, it is made in the stroma. You wanted to say it was made in the thylakoids, but that's not right. This is made in the stroma, in the liquid portion of the chloroplast. And you can pretty much narrow it down because it says outside the chloroplast, but photosynthesis occurs inside the chloroplast. So we can get rid of questions that don't mean anything to us so that we know that this is indeed inside the stroma. Okay? So in glycolysis, the main purpose is to what? Now, glycolysis does produce ATP within the cell. It does, but it produces only 2. Okay? So that's not one of the main purposes is to produce ATP. It does, however, in 11, it does convert some glucose to energy. However, the main thing it needs to do is to produce carbohydrates in order to move it on to that next step in the Krebs cycle. So the main purpose is to just kind of move that on, not to produce ATP, not to produce energy, because that would be the same thing, convert glucose to energy. And it does, but not enough for it to count. All it does is need to send our glucose that we put into glycolysis and shove it over into carbohydrates. 12. In the following equation for photosynthesis, what are the products and what are the reactants? Now, we've talked about this, and we've talked about this, and talked about this. Our products are always going to be on the right side. Our reactants will always be on the left side. Okay, so therefore, with that being said, all I have to do is look and say, okay, my products are on the right side. So I have no other choice than for this to be here and to be A. Okay, number 13. What is the job of the Krebs cycle? Okay, so this is a trick question. Now, does the Krebs cycle in A produce ATP? Yes. Does it convert glucose to energy? No. That's the job of the glycolysis. So we have to say it's either A or it's B. Does it produce carbohydrates for the cell to move on to the next step? Is its main purpose to produce ATP in the cell? No, it produces 2. So it doesn't produce lots of anything. The main thing that we know is here. It produces carbohydrates for the cell to keep going to that next step, which is electron transport chain.